Can Syracuse football actually land five-star wide receiver Calvin Russell? Let's break it all down.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, it's all about Syracuse football 2026 recruiting. We were going to do a basketball podcast, but so much has happened over the last 24 hours, mainly with five-star wide receiver Calvin Russell. So that's what we're going to talk about here on today's show. We're going to talk about where Syracuse's 2026 recruiting class stands right now at the time of this recording, which is mid to late afternoon here on this Wednesday, July 2nd. We'll talk about some other recruits that you need to be aware of in 2026. But we're going to start the podcast talking about five-star wide receiver Calvin Russell, where Syracuse stands in the race for him, and whether or not the Orange actually have a chance to prevail in Calvin Russell's recruitment. All that and more here on today's edition of Locked On Syracuse. Now, before we get to everything, this episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. 2026 five-star wide receiver Calvin Russell, one of the five best receivers in the country, depending on the major recruiting service you would like to use, is nearing his decision for a verbal commitment. It is this Saturday, July 5th at 9 p.m. Eastern. Calvin Russell, for those that don't know, is a 6'5" wide receiver. He's 195 pounds. He's from Miami, Florida, and he is a two-sport athlete, so much so that he actually has multiple high major Division I basketball offers, including from Syracuse. So not only would Calvin Russell, if he decides to commit to Syracuse for 2026, not only would he be on the football team, he would also be on the basketball team in 2026. Now, we initially knew the top 8 list of schools for Calvin Russell. This has been out for quite a while here. Syracuse, obviously, we're still talking about Calvin Russell, so they made his top 8 along with Miami, Michigan, Florida, Florida State, LSU, Oregon, and North Carolina. But that's information we already knew from a while ago. But last night, it now appears that there is an unofficial Final Four with Calvin Russell. And I'll get into why I'm saying unofficial in just a moment. But the schools that made the cut for this unofficial Final Four: Syracuse, Oregon, Michigan, and Florida State. The reason why I say this is quote-unquote unofficial is because this is not coming from Calvin Russell himself. This is actually from an Instagram post, I believe, from one of his high school teammates from last year, a current Syracuse wide receiver commit in 2025, by the way, Darius Johnson. I'm going to pull up the post right now on YouTube for those that are watching this on YouTube. And a reminder, we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, every audio platform, Apple, Spotify. Here is the post, okay? Calvin Russell commitment B-Day party, and you can see in the middle there some of the logos, and those are the 4 schools that he is allegedly choosing from: Syracuse, Oregon, Florida State, and Michigan. And again, this post is coming from Darius Johnson, a 2025 Syracuse football commit who was teammates with Calvin Russell in high school. So what's going on? Calvin Russell's recruitment has been admittedly very, very difficult to gauge. It has. It has been a mystery. He has been keeping us on our toes, and more power to Calvin Russell for kind of keeping this hush-hush. Nobody really seems to have much of an idea of where this is going. Normally, when you're just a few days away from a commitment, people have a good idea of where a player is leaning. You start to see a lot of crystal ball predictions. All the insiders are saying, hey, it's this school. Remember with Messiah Hampton? We kind of had a feeling, even though we were hoping that the people were wrong, the insiders, that Oregon was ultimately going to be what he said on the day that he committed. And it was Oregon. Syracuse missed out on the Rochester native, a 4-star wide receiver recruit. With Calvin Russell, we don't know. For a while, it appeared to be a 2-horse race. It was going to be between Miami, his hometown team, and Syracuse, which seems like it would be unexpected, but it's because of his relationship with the coaching staff, more specifically Fran Brown. In fact, I've had on Locked On recruiting expert, host of the Portal podcast, Brian Smith, here on this podcast many times. And he once told a story on this podcast about meeting Calvin Russell. And he asked him, why is Syracuse standing out to you? Why is Syracuse in this recruitment to begin with? He's a 5-star wide receiver after all. He can go to pretty much any school he wants to in the country. There are probably schools out there that can offer more money than Syracuse. Let's just be honest here. But why Syracuse? And Calvin Russell responded to Brian Smith saying 2 words, or really just one specific name, not even words. Fran Brown. So obviously there's a big time relationship there. It's a very, very good relationship. Now, if you are following along this unofficial Final Four, Syracuse is still there, which is really good. And Miami's no longer there. But is it wise to count out Miami, his hometown team? I don't think so. I would be pretty surprised if he went to Miami at this point, but you never know. This recruitment can change on a dime. Like, who's got the buzz right now? It honestly all depends on where you look and what you're looking for specifically. If you want to find pieces where people think that Syracuse might be in the lead or at least a front runner, you can find them. On 3, Steve Wilfong thinks that Syracuse is right there with Calvin Russell, that they have a legitimate chance to actually get him. A Michigan insider actually believes that Syracuse could be the front runner despite not actually getting an official visit with Calvin Russell over the summer. Is it possible that Calvin Russell didn't take an official visit with Syracuse over the summer because he's been on campus a number of times? He knows what it's all about, and maybe Syracuse is the number one. It's the bar for him, and every other school is trying to match Syracuse? Maybe. That is certainly on the table. But again, if it depends on where you're looking. It depends on what information you're actually looking for. Because then if you go on 3, Stephen Wagner logged an LSU prediction on June 15th. And around that same time, Brian Smith, who I just mentioned, with the relationship with Fran Brown and everything, said, don't be surprised if Calvin Russell commits to LSU. This was back in mid-June. A Miami 24/7 sports insider a few days ago doesn't think that it's really a top 4. He thinks it's a top 3, and the top 3 are Florida State, Michigan, and Oregon, meaning Syracuse would be left out. So what's the main takeaway here? With Calvin Russell, I do think at this point that Syracuse has a shot. We just don't know what type of shot it actually is. There's no real way to actually gauge where this is headed. I think Michigan's getting some buzz right now, but that's because he's coming off an official visit with them. It's kind of the same deal with what happened after the LSU visit, how he had a lot of buzz there. Truthfully, this is one of those decisions and one of those rare instances where I don't think we'll actually know until he says a school on Saturday night. Again, very rare. With Messiah Hampton, 99% of us believed that he was going to go to Oregon. We were just fingers crossing, hoping that he was going to say Syracuse. So it leads me to this now. Does Syracuse actually need to prevail on Saturday? I'd love to turn it over to you right now in the comments section below, because there's a lot of rumblings out there that whether he picks Syracuse or not on Saturday, he's going to visit campus during the football season over the fall. Like, he will be back on campus. Signing day is not until early December. So whether Syracuse gets him on Saturday or not, it's only a verbal commitment. and there's still plenty of time, plenty of months to actually flip Calvin Russell. However, let's say Calvin Russell picks a different school. Let's say he picks a school like Oregon or a school like Michigan. The odds of Syracuse, in my opinion, being able to flip him from one of those schools is very, very low. To the point where if Syracuse were to get him on Saturday, they have, in my opinion, a much higher chance of keeping him between then and signing day compared to he chooses somewhere else and Syracuse is going to try to flip him. So I do think it is very important that Syracuse lands Calvin Russell. They get that verbal commitment from him on Saturday night. But maybe you feel differently. Maybe you have a lot of faith that even if he picks a different school, that Syracuse is going to be right there on signing day with a chance to flip him. Comment in the comments section below. Again, I think it is imperative that if Syracuse is going to ultimately sign Calvin Russell, which cannot occur until early December, they're going to have to get his verbal commitment on Saturday. Otherwise, flipping him from an Oregon, a Michigan, even a lesser extent, a Florida State, it ain't going to be very easy. Much easier to hold on to him than to try to convince him to leave one of those top-tier programs. But comment in the comments section below. So that's the latest with Calvin Russell. I wish I could provide more like an expert prediction, but he's keeping us on our toes. And let's hope that Syracuse can ultimately land him this Saturday. Now, coming up, we'll talk about other recruits that you need to be aware of this week that are announcing their decisions. Plus, Syracuse football got their 25th verbal commit in the class of 2026, and we'll talk about him next on Locked On Syracuse. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. So you have a checking account, a savings account, maybe you have a retirement account as well. You can combine them all into one. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. This is Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and we still got plenty more to discuss with 2026 Syracuse football recruiting. But before we do so, shout out to all of you and thank you to all of you who continue to like and subscribe to Locked On Syracuse each and every day. You all are truly the best. And if you haven't done so already and you've already made it this far in the podcast, if you could just do me a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and perhaps tell one or two of your closest Syracuse friends about the Locked On Syracuse podcast so this channel can grow and reach all Syracuse Orange fans. Again, thank you all so much for the continued support to Locked On Syracuse. Now let's get back to talking about 2026 football recruiting. We just talked about Calvin Russell. No more Calvin Russell here, all right? But Syracuse has two more big pending decisions coming up this week. Plus, we have to discuss Syracuse's latest commit in the class of 2025 or 2026, excuse me. But let's get into some of the big decisions here. Number one, CJ Hester, 6'1", 185-pound, four-star defensive back out of Cocoa, Florida. He was originally supposed to make his decision on Tuesday, but the Post-Standard reported it'll now be on Thursday. So that is tomorrow, Thursday, July 2nd. He did take an official visit to Syracuse on June 6th. And Hester has also taken official visits to Florida, Auburn, Iowa, and Georgia, according to 24/7 Sports. For a while with CJ Hester, it appeared that Florida was the front runner to ultimately prevail for him. Now it also looks like that Georgia is getting heavily involved. So I would not be surprised if Hester committed to Florida or Georgia on Thursday. In regards to Syracuse and CJ Hester, I would be pleasantly surprised. I'm a Syracuse fan. I'm a Syracuse alum. I want all of the best players and all of the best coaches and all the best managers and everything like that to go to Syracuse. But there are other programs around the country hoping for the exact same thing. And ultimately, I would be pleasantly surprised again if CJ Hester picks Syracuse. I guess the good news is that there is somewhat of a chance. They did get him for an official visit, and they do have current Syracuse player, Demetrius Samuel Jr., a true freshman, recruiting him. I think they live very close to each other in their hometown. So maybe that could have an effect on this recruitment. But as of right now with CJ Hester, it's supposed to be on Thursday. I would hope that it's Syracuse, but my thinking is that it's either going to be Florida or Georgia that ultimately get it. Then you got Julius Miles, another big-time decision nearing here. 6'6", 210-pound, 3-star tight end from Freeport, Florida. That is not too far from Florida State's campus. And unsurprisingly, he has a top 3 that includes Florida State, along with Syracuse and Louisville. He's actually announcing his college decision on the same day as Calvin Russell, but I do believe it'll be earlier in the day. As I said in the previous segment, Calvin Russell is announcing his decision at night. He's announcing it at 9 p.m. Eastern. Miles, like CJ Hester, he did officially visit Syracuse on June 6th. Miles also took an official visit to Louisville on June 20th. The favorite appears to be Louisville. That being said, I would be more surprised Syracuse lands CJ Hester than Syracuse lands Julius Miles. I do think Syracuse has a legitimate chance to get Julius Miles, but it appears that Louisville is the favorite ultimately to get him. Now, those are the two big decisions that are coming up aside from Calvin Russell. Let's get into a commit, someone who has already chosen to play for Syracuse football in the class of 2026. Walt Frazier, 6'3", 285-pound, 3-star defensive lineman from Pennsylvania. Frazier is the 25th verbal commit in Syracuse's 2026 recruiting class, and the news actually broke a couple of days ago. I was going to talk about it, but decided, hey, let's wait until there's more recruiting news and kind of pack them all in together. So that's what we're doing here. And he's actually a high-end 3-star recruit. This is not a prospect you should sleep on, in my opinion. 24/7 Sports composite rankings have Frazier as a top 70 overall defensive lineman in the country. That is pretty high up there. Top 70 defensive lineman and top 600 player overall in the country on the 24/7 Sports composite rankings. And for context, what top 600 means, the top 425 players are 4 stars or better. So he's not too far from being a 4-star. He's just not quite there yet. That's why I say he is a high-end 3-star recruit. He ultimately chose Syracuse over Kentucky and UConn. Those were the other schools that got official visits over the summer. And I believe that Cincinnati was also a school that took a run at him as well. I don't think they got him on campus, though, but they did offer him a scholarship. So nice recruiting win for Syracuse football. So having said that, feels like the perfect transition to talk about where the 2026 recruiting class stands right now and ultimately what the goal is for 2026. So stick with me here on Locked On Syracuse. This is Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer. Let's talk about where Syracuse football's 2026 recruiting class stands right now after the Orange recently got their 25th verbal commit of the class in Walt Frazier, a 3-star defensive lineman. Again, let's reiterate the goal. I have stated this plenty of times here on this podcast, so I'm going to sound like a broken record, and I apologize for those that watch and listen to this podcast every single day, but there are people that stumble upon this podcast for the very first time, or maybe this is not the first time for them, but it's the first football recruiting update video or podcast that they're checking out. So I have to reiterate the goal. Maybe you feel differently. Again, this is just my opinion, my goal for Syracuse football, and feel free to chime in the comment section below here. I'm hoping that Syracuse can get a top 30 class nationally in 2026. It's the third recruiting class of the Fran Brown era. You had 2024, that was his first one, 2025, the second one, and now 2026 is the third one. Keep in mind that recruiting is always for the following year. So we're going into the 2025 season, but we're talking about the 2026 recruiting cycle and so on and so forth. When we're talking about the 2026 season, we're going to talk about 2027 recruiting. Understand that? Okay. But here's why I also say top 30. It's because it's not like Syracuse is that far off in recent years. In 2024, they were 37th in the composite rankings. In 2025, they took a little bit of a step back, but it wasn't that much of a step back. They were 43rd in the country. And currently, the good news is that Syracuse is 26th in the country per 24/7 Sports and the 24/7 Sports composite rankings overall. So that's really nice. They have 25 verbal commits, 4 of which are 4 stars on at least 2 major recruiting services. For those that don't know the 4 major recruiting services, you got Rivals, On3, ESPN, and 24/7 Sports. You can be a 4-star and a 3-star or 5. Every recruiting service can have a different ranking. But if you get 2 or more recruiting services saying the same thing, it's usually a pretty good sign. And Syracuse, with their 4-star recruits, all have multiple recruiting services saying that they are 4-star recruits. You got wide receiver Amari Goff, you got edge rusher Jarius Rogers, offensive lineman Javion Cooper, and defensive lineman Cameron Wilson. Is the goal feasible? Top 30? Comment in the comments section below your thoughts on that. But look, this week is massive for Syracuse recruiting. They could firmly solidify themselves in the top 30 nationally and maybe put themselves top 20 nationally if things can go their way this weekend. Maybe they do land CJ Hester. Maybe they do land Julius Miles. 5-star wide receiver Calvin Russell. They get 5-star wide receiver Calvin Russell. He would be the highest ranked Syracuse recruit in 20 years. This is one of the best players in the country here. You get this kid, you're going to have a top 30 national class. You get CJ Hester, you might have a top 30 class. Julius Miles, big time 3-star tight end. Kind of like how Walt Frazier is a high-end 3-star recruit. And there's more. Syracuse is also appears to be a 2-horse race to go get former Florida State commit Xavier Payne. He decommitted from the program. He's now on the market, I guess, so to speak. Colorado is going back and forth too. They got Deion Sanders, just like with Fran Brown, and not underestimating his recruiting prowess. You don't want to underestimate Deion Sanders in recruiting either. He is an expert recruiter. There's also Tadarius Hughes, a 4-star defensive back, currently a Florida State commit, but he did officially visit Syracuse over the summer in late June. Can they flip him? There's a lot of loose ends with Syracuse football recruiting, and they're in a good spot right now. But this is the type of week and weekend where they can firmly put themselves in the top 30 and maybe even top 20 nationally and establish themselves as a school that has arrived in recruiting. What Fran Brown has done so far is taken Syracuse out of the basement in recruiting. With Fran Brown, I highly doubt that Syracuse will ever finish where they used to finish prior to him, which is top 60 maybe in a good year, sometimes well outside of it in a bad year. That's not going to happen anymore with Fran Brown. They're getting better talent. They're getting 4 stars at times. This is a big-time week, though, for Syracuse to potentially take that next step with football recruiting. Now, that is it for the football recruiting portion of this podcast. But let's talk about what's coming up next on Locked On Syracuse. Again, I apologize. I teased it in the last episode. We were going to talk about Syracuse basketball, but then the unofficial top 4 list came out for Calvin Russell, and we just had to discuss it here on this podcast because it's a big time commitment potentially, right? But barring any breaking news, tomorrow we are going to talk about Syracuse basketball wings and do a position preview. We'll talk about the shooting guards and the small forwards. I understand that CJ Hester is announcing his commitment tomorrow. If he does commit to Syracuse, well, that's the big breaking news that will supersede the Syracuse basketball position preview podcast. But if he doesn't, which I don't think he will, to be honest with you, we'll talk about Syracuse basketball, and I will mention CJ Hester and if he did not commit to Syracuse in that podcast. Friday, we got Poll Friday, and it's going to be Syracuse basketball related again. How will Syracuse do in the Vegas Players Era Challenge against Houston and Gonzaga? On the last podcast, we discussed that they're playing those two opponents and how they're going to be very challenging. On Friday, we're going to talk more about why they're challenging and whether or not Syracuse could actually steal a game off one of those two teams. Over the weekend, there will definitely be a podcast over the weekend, whether it's Saturday or Sunday. Unfortunately, it's just really bad timing. I will not be around to record a podcast on Saturday night at this point for the Calvin Russell announcement. But I will be around Sunday to do a podcast on it. That's the good news. Also, again, Julius Miles is announcing his commitment on the same day as Calvin Russell, but that's earlier in the day. And if it does go Syracuse's way, if he does ultimately pick Syracuse, I think there might be time for me to record a podcast on Saturday. If not, we'll talk about it on Sunday. So no matter what, you can bank on Sunday there being a football recruiting podcast. Okay? So I know I threw a lot at you. I'll just briefly summarize it right now. What's coming up next on Locked On Syracuse tomorrow, barring any big breaking news, Syracuse basketball wing position preview. Friday is Poll Friday, how Syracuse will do against Houston and Kansas. And then on Sunday, it is another Syracuse football recruiting update. Calvin Russell and Julius Miles. That's all coming up next on Locked On Syracuse in the near future. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. And now for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On Portal Show with football expert Brian Smith, who's got the latest rumors and signings each and every day in recruiting. Be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to college football. Find the Portal Podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button. If you really enjoy the podcast, be sure to hit subscribe. Tell all your friends about Locked On Syracuse, and I will see you all again soon.